In The Zombies Are Coming, the realities of the zombie apocalypse in American culture, Kelly J. Baker succinctly defines the zombie apocalypse genre. Quote, "Something bad happens. Often we don't know what exactly, and the dead reanimate with a grisly hunger for human brains or flesh. These monsters quickly bring about the end of the world as we've come to know it." End quote. The humans who do survive are left trying to grapple with these mindless monsters, and often with each other, as the world becomes a lawless dog-eat-dog hellscape. As Baker puts it, quote, "Chaos rules. Order is long gone." End quote.
If monsters are stand-ins for societal anxieties, then what do zombies stand in for? Do they highlight the horrors of war and pandemic outbreaks? Do they give us insight into fears of immigration or the hatred of the dehumanized other? Do they simply give us a moral pass to shoot things we don't like? In this episode of Horror Joy, we interview Kelly J. Baker to talk about her book, How Zombies Continue to Function as Cultural Hallmarks, and what that says about American popular culture. So, grab your freshest brains and shuffle along with us as we seek joy in the crumbling ruins of our post-apocalyptic world and ask, are zombies coming?
This is Horror Joy, a podcast celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
And I'm Jeff Stoyanoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona. So Brian, today we're talking zombies. We have an interview with Kelly J. Baker, and she talks about her book, The Zombies Are Coming, the realities of the zombie apocalypse in American culture. We look at zombies in movies, zombies in books, zombies in video games. Our first entry may be into video games. Kelly has a lot of interesting things to say. I think her book is really erudite and gives us some fertile ground to go over with zombies. So things that stuck out to you, things about this interview that really resonated with you.
Yeah, I like that Kelly takes a kind of pop culture approach to zombies. So like you said, there's so much that is touched by zombies. Movies, books, games, whatever you want, zombies are there. For me, the thing that I keep thinking about is the way that people use zombies to stand in for other things that they don't already like. So we'll talk a lot about that with Kelly, but the idea of choosing somebody you don't like, making it a zombie, and therefore it's okay to shoot, and perpetuating those kinds of cultural practices and habits, I think is really interesting and something that we need to think about. What about you? Anything that really stuck out to you when we talked to Kelly?
What you're saying about the ways in which zombies can be these dehumanized bodies that become cultural sites of appropriation in a strange way, or sites of cultural anxiety that we then are free to destroy, often in epic fashion in film, video games. You and I will talk more about that probably in the next episode, or maybe our failures at video games. But these bodies become essentially the equivalent of clay pigeons often. And in a culture that loves guns, this culture is really excited about zombies.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that there's so much to say about race, gender, immigration, and zombies. And like you said, we'll get into that. We're going to talk to Kelly this episode. Next episode, we are going to look at a couple movies. We'll look at Romero's The Night of the Living Dead, which is one of my favorite movies. And we'll talk about video games. We'll see if we're just really bad at them. But yeah, interview with Kelly was insightful, helpful for thinking about zombies, and worth the topic for sure. Her book is very good. Like you said, erudite, but it's also a quick read. So hope you all enjoy our interview with Kelly J. Baker. We are joined today by Kelly J. Baker. She is an author. She's written quite a few books. One of them we'll talk about today. It's called Zombies Are Coming, all about zombies and popular culture. She's also written Final Girl and other essays on grief, trauma, and mental illness. And she is also the author of The Gospel According to the Klan, the KKK's Appeal to Protestant America, and the co-host of the podcast, Pod Only Knows. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to y'all.
Yeah, we are excited to talk to you. I mean, so the whole thing about this podcast, it's called Horror Joy. We are interested in kind of this relationship, this connection between joy and horror. And so wanted to know if you have those connections, if you've had experiences of joy about horror, joy related to horror, and if there are any specific examples, movies, books, games, whatever it is that you have that you want to tell us about.
Yeah, so I grew up a horror fan, is what I should say, if you couldn't tell from the book. I grew up reading Stephen King way, way, way early in middle school, something that I've kept my kids from doing, even though they keep asking. Most recently, my, I think, keen experience of joy with this is that I did a Scream movie marathon with my teenager.
Like scary movies.
Which was a lot of fun. So some 90s meta horror with them and just kind of going back and like watching that and thinking through that as an older adult now, an elder millennial, I guess is what we are, or geriatric millennials. I don't know, whatever you want to call us. But just being able to like watch something that was so endearing to me as like an older teenager, an early 20 something, that I got a lot of like comfort horror, I guess is what I would call it, you know, like if a slasher film could be comfort horror in some sort of way, but you know, that it's routine, that it makes a lot of sense, right? That it has a pattern, that kind of thing. That's all that I've always liked about horror, is that it follows rules.
There are certain rules.
And Scream is something that makes that so explicit, right? That they play around with that a lot in that those films. And it's something that I've always enjoyed about the genre, is that for someone with anxiety, I really like horror because I just know like that it's going to follow a pattern, and I know that it's going to stick to that pattern, and I can kind of move my way through it and not entirely be surprised, right? You know, you might be shocked at who the killer is, but you kind of know that there's going to be that reveal. So for me, it's a comforting genre, and that makes it joyful, I think, in some kind of way, is that I can kind of relax while watching it, which sounds kind of strange to say, but it works for me. I have a friend who's really into like crime noir sort of stuff, and he's like, I don't know how as an anxious person you can watch this. And I'm like, no, it really makes sense if you like know the patterns and know the style, right? Like this really like works for me in a kind of way.
I love that. We were recently on Straight White American Jesus, and I made a terrible analogy about sweating at the opera in terms of that's not an appropriate place to sweat. But when you watch a horror movie, it's an appropriate place to be anxious. And like you said, it's kind of, you know what's happening, you know what to expect, and it kind of relieves that sense of anxiety. I love that.
Yeah. It works for me in that sort of way. And so like when folks take it out of the like expected patterns is when I don't do well with it.
Understandable. So, Kelly, in your book, The Zombies Are Coming, you talk about zombie video games. And one of the things that we are trying to do with this podcast is talk about horror in media beyond just movies and books, which I think are primarily the sources we think of when we think about zombies, probably movies for zombies, you know, going back to Romero's Night of the Living Dead, especially. But zombie video games, you talk about how they're so popular. So I guess my question for you is, why do they remain so popular? And given the title of our podcast, Horror Joy, is there some sort of maybe sadistic joy that people get out of shooting other bodies that are somehow sanctioned to be shot because they're not humans? Air quotes under not human there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I always kind of wonder about the popularity of being able to shoot up zombies as some sort of like moral pass. Like that's always kind of been my sense about this, is that with zombies, you can just do whatever you want. And I wonder if that's part of the popularity with the genre in general, is that there's just this sense that you can kind of get away with anything. It's sort of like the popularity of like Nazis in a previous time period, where you could like shoot Nazis and feel okay about this in some sort of way. Like we're in a weird space now about that in a way that we weren't previously. But with zombies, I feel like, because again, like you said, in that kind of scare quote, not human way, you can do whatever you want to them, like on screen, and it doesn't matter. The moral compass is gone in some kind of way. And so I always wonder about that as part of the popularity, because since they're monsters, what you do is you kill monsters. End of story. And so I think that that's part of it, right? That it's a lot of fun. And what I discovered is when I taught undergraduates, like this is always what they told me, is it was this really interesting thing, as I would do units in this apocalypse class that I taught, and they could be critical analyst about anything. Like we could be critical analysts about like evangelical apocalypses, right? Or like eco disaster stories or these sorts of things. But we got to zombies and they're like, no, Dr. Baker, it's just fun. Why won't you let us have fun? Why are you ruining this for us?
I have a complicated relationship with zombies.
And they didn't want to press it
They're dangerous, but I love their swagger.
because it was like a joyful thing for them. This is like the last frontier where I was like taking away their ability to like have this great time, you know, which is what I think pop culture scholars do, is take away our fun. But I think that like you're onto something there, that it's very much this piece where it's like, this is like the fun component of it, right? That we don't want to like think about what if there is something going on here ethically that we should pay attention to, that we should really interrogate this a little bit more or pay attention to that instead of like, this does bring me joy, or this is a lot of fun, or like, why can't I shoot up zombies in my video game? So I think there is that larger appeal of these games that folks think that they don't have to turn on that part of their brain in a way that you would with some of these other more realistic games where it is humans that you're fighting against.
Yeah, when you're talking about your students in that way, it reminds me of a former colleague at an institution I used to teach at, who was the sweetest woman that I've ever met. But she would talk glowingly about shooting zombies and just have a great time shooting up all of these zombies. And I would think to myself, this does not make sense. There's some sort of contradiction happening here. But it seems like your students were going through that, trying to figure out how this is okay. Like, why is this so much fun? Why is this allowed to be so much fun?
Yeah, and please don't take it away from me. This is the last vestige of fun that I can have, right? In this sort of violent way. And like, please don't take it away from me. And so much of like what I was trying to think through with The Zombies Are Coming is to like think through the ethics of that and the zombie apocalypse in pop culture. Because I think for so many people, it is like such fun. And it is like a joyful kind of thing, like prepping or doing these kinds of things. And to kind of press on that a little bit and say, you know, what's going on here and why can this be fun? And in other scenarios, it's not, right? And, you know, I don't want to ruin the fun entirely, but maybe just a little bit.
I mean, it's so weird to say, oh, I don't want to ruin your fun shooting things. Well, what is it that we can shoot then? But, I mean, that's interesting. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, I think, just because what you're saying makes me think about the COVID-19 pandemic in a sense. So one thing that I've been thinking about lately is why we don't think of zombie stories as pandemic stories. And so I'm curious to know if you have thoughts about that. But on top of that, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic had any impact on the way that we understand the zombie image, even the kind of fun of shooting zombies? We've just lived through this thing. Has it changed, do you think, the way that we understand zombies?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question about like why zombie stories aren't more often understood as like pandemic stories, because oftentimes that's how they start, right? Like we have like great examples of this in zombie cinema where it starts out as like some sort of flu or some sort of thing that happens where this is how we get this, but we don't think of them in that way. We think of them as zombie stories instead of as pandemic stories. And so with the pandemic, like in the depths of the pandemic, right, I kept waiting for like some sort of zombie renaissance. I was waiting for it to happen and it didn't. And this is because we had like a lot of time on our hands during lockdown where I was like, I'm just kind of waiting for that moment. And occasionally you would have like memes, you know, about folks that were banging on doors, waiting for their haircuts to come back. Do you remember this like classic image that like occurred? And people would be like, oh, they're like zombies. But we didn't have a resurgence of zombie media or like a resurgence of like zombie tales, which I thought was really fascinating. And I wonder if it was too close for comfort. You know, there was something about it that was just like, it was too close to what was going on, that folks just didn't want to have that experience of it. Or that the experience of a real pandemic was not the experience of what it was like the way zombie movies made it look like. Because one of the like running jokes in my household was that the COVID-19 pandemic was a slow pandemic, right? It wasn't like everything shut down and you couldn't find spoons and you're suddenly on the frontier and you're fighting zombies, a la The Walking Dead. That's not what happened. Is folks were locked down, people were getting really sick, they were in hospitals, but it wasn't like the massive like shutdown of society that happens in a zombie film that happens rapidly and all of a sudden you're fighting for survival against your neighbors. That wasn't what was going on in some sort of way, right? And so part of me wondered if that was what was happening too. The reality of like the daily grind of the pandemic versus what Hollywood made it look like was just sort of so different that it just didn't work together very well.
That makes me think of too, is in your book, you talk a little bit about how horror generally, but zombies in particular, simplify the story. And so
Yeah.
maybe we just weren't able to simplify it enough. And now looking back, it's unclear how we navigate the thing that we've all gone through and the trauma and all that kind of stuff.
The trauma and the complexity on like so many levels of what it was to live through something like that. And the tragedy of it too, right? How do you navigate that in a simple narrative? I think it's a hard thing to do that doesn't work very easily with a zombie us versus them narrative very well. I mean, maybe in 20 years you can simplify it down, you know, but maybe I think it's too fresh now for that to work out very well.
That's interesting. Thinking about zombies in light of the pandemic with Brian's question there. Another issue you bring up in your book is how the zombie apocalypse is used often as a means of selling guns. And we saw that a lot during the pandemic as well. When things began to shut down, preppers were flooding Dick's Sporting Goods or whatever local gun shop was there to buy ammunition because there was going to be a run on ammunition and all of these sorts of things. So to that end, in the book, you're highlighting that element of zombie culture, but then how these fantasies, they kind of indict our culture as one of racism, classism, sexism. With that, I'm curious if you have any examples of where zombie stories are transgressing cultural norms instead of amplifying them. Like, is there a way we can find joy in that way?
Yeah, so I had to think hard about this. And so what I'll say is I haven't watched like every zombie movie out there, read every zombie book. But the thing that came to mind for me was there were two examples. The first is Warm Bodies, which is an interesting zombie movie to me and is kind of a polarizing zombie film because of the way it works out. Zombies who are cognizant,
Why can't I connect with people?
who have feelings,
All right.
who are sentient, who work against us.
Because I'm dead.
And in the end, it's kind of almost like a utopian ending, which is odd for the genre. But it's one of the few that I can like sit through and like rewatch and I'm like, I have hope for humanity. How often does that happen when I watch something in this genre where I'm like, this could work out in some sort of way. This is amazing, you know? So I think of that movie quite often when I think about that because of like barriers breaking down instead of actually being erected in some sort of way. The other thing I thought about is there's this book by Alden Bell called The Reapers Are the Angels, and it's a pretty traditional zombie story, but the narrator is a young woman, and one of the things that happens is that she finds beauty and like majesty in the ruins of the world as it's fallen apart. And so it's one of the like few examples that I can think of where the world is falling apart, but there are pleasures, simple pleasures of finding things along the road that bring you joy or finding nature's majesty. And so like there are zombies to contend with, but there's still things that work in the world. So it's not so dystopian as a lot of the other zombie media is. Like it ends in tragedy, I should say. I should let you know ahead of time. It doesn't have a happy ending, but it's like one of the few that I picked up that I was like, oh, this is actually kind of like a refreshing read, you know, because you're like wandering the landscape with her. You have a fresh-eyed narrator in some kind of way where you can find things that aren't terrible about this place. And that's kind of a nice space to be in instead of like everything is terrible, which is so often what this genre has going on. Not only is it dystopian, it's going to out dystopian itself. Like you think people are bad? No, right? Like we're going to make them even worse than you imagine them to be, which is what I felt like turning into The Walking Dead every week is it's like, no, man, like you thought they were bad. Like we're going to up the ante every week and just make them worse. So that I had to like eventually abandon that show or I was going to give up on humanity. It's like, I can't handle this. I try to be a pretty optimistic human about like humanity in general, or I couldn't do the kind of work that I do. But like, it is just one of those things where I was like, oh, this is terrible people being even more terrible. So when I find that kind of stuff that's refreshing or has a different take where it's like, no, actually, zombies could be good. Huh. Like, that's an interesting flip on this. Like, that zombies could be different than we imagine them to be. Or the dystopia could have those glimmers of moments where the world works out to be better than it is. That's kind of nice too. So that those would be the two that I tend to come back to when I think about this genre.
Right. So I'm out of curiosity, did you watch The Last of Us?
I did watch The Last of Us. Yes.
Okay. So I'm thinking of the episode Long, Long Time, the one that was the really highly controversial episode 3 of the series, where you have the gay couple, and
take things in stride.
that's, for me, was one of the first times in a zombie show I saw some room for hope. Now, I'm not getting into like spoilers and stuff, but
Right.
you know, it still sort of comes back to it, but not in the same way that you're talking about with The Walking Dead, which I think 3 for 3 on the folks in this interview right now stopped watching the series at some point for the reasons you described. So I'm glad I'm not alone in that.
It feels as though there is a common idea in zombie films and shows like The Walking Dead, or even a movie that I am fond of, 28 Days Later. There is a sense in which, oh, what we're doing is we're going to show that humans are the bad ones, right? The
Right.
army comes in or whatever, and they're the bad ones. And that's hard because then you start to say, well, now I'm even more skeptical of everybody else, right? I can just kind of enter the world and think, yeah, we're the worst. Therefore, I'm just going to close myself off to everybody. And this book that you're talking about, it's not as if, oh, zombies are great, but that there's something about how we can now take that and re-enter our world and say, man, it's kind of beautiful here. There's something good here. It refreshes that kind of sense of enjoyment, the joy of the world in which we inhabit. So I'm curious, right? This is something that I've thought about for a little bit now. I like the idea of understanding where our monstrous images come from. So there's a book by W. Scott Poole where he talks about the zombie as or kind of originating in World War I. His claim is something like, well, we saw all these people not only die, right? So many people died, and we were worried that they were going to come back as something horrific. But the people that did come back were like Walking Dead. Other people saw World War I along with the Spanish flu and thought, man, there's something strange going on here. Something like J'accuse shows up, and here we get the zombie image. So you talk about voodoo and voodoo in your book a little bit. I didn't know if you had a take on where we find the kind of most prominent origin for the zombie image. Yeah, is it in one of those things? Is it something else?
I don't know that I have real strong feelings on where this comes from. I mean, a lot of my kind of feelings about this are also about sort of how we have the pop culture images that become so strong. And I think about how Romero in particular is drawing from like Vietnam injuries. Like they have makeup artists that are thinking this through about images of war and what happens to people in this. I think Scott has done some really good work about this. And it's not surprising to me either, right, that we're talking about victims of pandemics or victims of war when we're thinking about these images. The folks that haunt us are these monstrous images. That is just not sort of what I was the most interested in, is sort of where it comes from. I think a lot about Avery Gordon, who's a sociologist, who talks about, you know, those absences that are what haunt us, the stuff that we can't work through, you know, and don't give ourselves that time to process that trauma culturally, is the stuff that comes back at us some sort of way. And I think that we get a lot of that in horror, is the stuff that we just haven't processed in a way that we need to, finds its way to bubble through. And we find that culturally in different periods. And I think it's so fascinating that in some periods it's like really clear cut. Like you have a monster that's really like genre bound to a certain time period, so that slasher films happen in a certain time period and are really bound by that. And vampires kind of come and go, but like zombies, man, like they just don't go away. So that there's something there about the imagery that they have and the way that they're attached to us that we just haven't worked through, whether it's like pandemic, whether it's like that we don't know how to deal with the dead. Like there's something going on there culturally that Americans are just bad at, that just keeps being resurrected again and again. And I don't have a good handle on what that is, but I find it really fascinating that we just can't get rid of it. So much so that we just have this pop up over and over and over. Yeah, people all the time are like, are zombies over? And I'm like, they're never over, right? Like, we just haven't worked through whatever we need to work through to get rid of them. And I was like, we even have Disney trying to get us to work through zombies in some sort of way. If even Disney is working through it, something's going on, you know?
It's interesting to think about thinking through zombies, the way you're phrasing that, because you talk about millennialism and hope. And earlier we talked about your students and how they sort of still find joy in shooting zombies. But one of the things that strikes me about millennialism and hope with sort of younger generations, because I think all of us in this call are geriatric millennials, as you said earlier, I feel like there's been some shifts, cultural shift with students. And I'm wondering, do younger generations enjoy horror, specifically zombies, as much as our generations do? And if not, what's shifted? What's happened? I mean, like, your evidence would suggest that the students do tend to still like shooting zombies, but again, I really like this phrase. Are they thinking through zombies in the same way that we are?
Yeah, I haven't been in the classroom in a while, so I don't know where they're at anymore. I know that I have a teenager at home who is not into zombies. Now, this could be for a number of reasons. This could be like indicative of Gen Z, or it could be indicative of having a mom who works on this stuff and is just really determined to like not do this. I mean, so like teenage rebellion, there's some really funny like things, but I think there's this interesting fatalism in Gen Z about the world that's a completely realistic fatalism about the environment, about geopolitical conflict, about the state of fascism and our politics, that they're just kind of looking down the barrel of, that they maybe don't find apocalyptic tales that appealing because they feel like they're already dealing with a number of apocalyptic dangers. It was one of the things that when I was covering higher ed as a journalist, we would have all of these surveys come out covering Gen Z, and just the way that they understood the state of affairs of the world, where they're just like, do you know what we're dealing with? Like what we're worried about? So like, why would I care about a zombie apocalypse? You know, like why would I care about zombies, or what would have to work for them because of what they're dealing with? Whereas I think it was a little bit more distanced and less pressing for us in some ways. Not to say that we weren't dealing with conflicts and those sorts of things growing up too, but I feel like it's a pressure cooker for them in a way that they're dealing with this. And yeah, it's just, it makes it, I think, harder. And that there's a level of like a lack of hope that is like distressing for the way that they're dealing with it. And that it's not just my teenager, right? It's their friends too. That when I talk to them, I'm just like, oh, you know, I have this moment where I'm like, all the mom hugs are not going to make a difference here about the way that they understand the future.
Totally my experience in the classroom currently with Gen Z students. But I think what you spoke about there is really astute. I think that zombies for us, for our generation, almost represent hope in that strange way, where it's a vessel to play out what isn't happening. Whereas for this generation, it seems like you're suggesting they're saying this is happening to people, not to zombies. Because again, zombies aren't quite people. We're not really sure what to do with that. But in ways that make it not enjoyable because it's too close to home, one might say.
Yeah, I think so. I think that apocalyptic tales are just not fantasy in a way for them, that it just is not fun escapism. Why read The Hunger Games right now?
Yeah, one thing about horror that I've held on to is this idea that as a genre, it's in some way about what's going on right now, but in a way that showcases something that is outside of our logic, that bursts in and threatens us.
Mhm.
But here in this conversation, there's something about how the apocalypse, I mean, I'm not sure if we want to go that far,
Right.
is now no longer outside of our logic. It's just actually the way things are. And that's hard to think about, to say, oh, we're just living in that world. We don't even need the zombie anymore. But the things that, Jeff, you just mentioned too, I think are really interesting in that. So in your book, you talk a lot about how people have purchased dummies specifically that seem to look like people that they might want to shoot. And so the
Right.
zombie becomes a very thin veil for the way that people are in danger. And so again, we're bringing this to the explicit front. It's like zombies have already done some of the work. We see that it's not okay to treat women like this, right? It's not okay to treat Black people like this. It's not okay to treat them as subhuman, and therefore we can just shoot them. It's also, we've convinced everybody that humans are, in fact, just the worst. We don't need zombies anymore. I'm not sure if I'm leaning on hope or if I'm saying, oh no, what have we done?
No, I think it's super hard. I mean, and I think this is where I struggle, is that I want to be hopeful about where we are at the same time that I feel like you have to be somewhat realistic about where we are too. And those are warring emotions about where we are. And so you're right. What do you do when the horror has already leached in, when you're already facing it? And as someone that studies the apocalypse, you don't want the apocalyptic leaching into reality. Like, that's the last thing that you want to be dealing with, is these kinds of scenarios. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is people that are doing prep.
The zombie preppers believe an apocalypse is imminent.
They're doing, emergency campaigns around, like, you prepare for zombies instead of preparing for hurricanes, because it's so much more fun to prepare for zombies than it is to prepare for a Category 5 hurricane. Just because in the grand scheme of things, it's a lot more fun to think I will get all of the supplies I need to prepare for zombies than to think about the fact that Mother Nature can take you out with a Category 5 hurricane, which is what happens. Because I live in an area that went through this, and it was like mass destruction. So it is the precipice that we live on that reality is so barely contained by chaos. We're so this thin veil that we have on the order of the world. And I think this is what I like about horror too, is that it unveils how, like, much that order is like an illusion and how chaotic things really are. I mean, and this is part of what has always appealed to me about horror. And I think, again, this is the anxiety piece that I speak to too, which is I know the chaos is there. And when people watch horror with me, then they know the chaos is there too. It's that moment that they can peek inside my brain too, where it's like, no, you understand for a moment that this is what could happen. And so I've always appreciated that about horror, that there's like a truthfulness about reality that's in there that makes me nervous as hell. But there's something like that's also kind of comforting about that too, because of the truth tellingness of it, I think, that I like. It's not that I think that I need to worry about slashers, right? But there's some sort of underlying truth that we can't have this orderliness about society. There's always something that's kind of lurking there that we're paying attention to too, whether it's zombies or slashers that are representing the chaotic forces that we're dealing with, whether that be climate change or pandemics or social unrest or whatever,
I wonder if we could go back even to the question about the CDC. So you claim that the CDC used the zombie image as a mechanism for training people how to be prepared. And I wonder if you have insight about whether or not that worked for COVID. It seems like it should have, if it worked at all. It's like, here we are. What you should do is you should get ready for this kind of thing. Get your water bottles. But did it work?
It would have been brilliant for them to use that again, but they didn't. It would have been really smart to use a previous campaign that way. Like, it would have fit. Like, zombies make a lot more sense for pandemic prep than they make sense for hurricane prep. The examples work much better, but it was like a missed opportunity there entirely, that they just did not do that. But it would have been genius to be like, look at how people had to act in something like 28 days later. Look at how you had to do this. But no, they just completely missed the opportunity.
I appreciate how you're talking about how horror is responding to like things going on in a cultural moment, right? We have an episode on religious horror looking at Immaculate and Saint Maud, thinking about how in some ways Immaculate's responding to the crisis of women's reproductive health right now going on in this country. But also we've just spent 10 minutes talking about how, not that we're post-horror, but that we are maybe so close to the apocalypse that it's difficult to find where zombies fit in horror and in media in 2024. We still see zombie movies coming out. We still see slasher movies coming out. I mean, you opened talking about Scream and how Scream also holds a really close spot in my heart from the late 90s.
What's your favorite scary movie?
But they're responding to sort of elements of concern that were going on in the culture at that time. Horror movies now, can they still talk about these macro issues? Can they still talk about these big picture issues that face a culture as a whole? Or maybe speaking of some of your other work, are we becoming so fractured as a society that it's difficult to have those sort of more macro conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was trying to think about if I'm even watching more recent horror movies or not, or if they seem like they're more for different audiences. Like I was trying to think about, are there big horror movies now that encompass wide audiences? Or if I've just even aged out. I don't know, right? Like it's hard for me to kind of tell. I watched the newer Scream movies and I was like, like, okay. But I'm like, I'm not sure they had a larger message. Like, are they pushing against like cultural things, or are they just slasher films? I'm not sure that they have that moment. I'm not sure that they're doing that in the same kind of way. And I just am not sure that we're having those kind of same effects because that monoculture has fractured so much, right? Like it's hard because you can kind of pick your audience. I mean, it's kind of interesting that with streaming and with all those different platforms, you never know. When I talk to like my teens friends about what they're interested in, it's like I'm talking to aliens. And it's not just because of the age difference. It's because pick your platform or pick where they're finding stuff or these kinds of things. Because I would have to be on like YouTube, but I would also have to be on like Disney Plus, but I would also have to be on like Peacock. And I don't know about you, but like how in the world can I keep up with that and also keep a job and raise a family and do these kinds of things? And then also go to the movie theater? Like just to keep up with that is impossible. And then read books, like also read the books that are coming out. It's just, there's so much, I feel like, too, that maybe this makes me sound super old, and that's okay if that's the case. But I feel like there was a moment where there was less. And it was not as hard to keep up with because there were less channels and there was less. And so I think that there might be stuff that has really good commentary. I just don't know where to find it, or if I'm missing it somehow in like the mass of the internet or the mass of streaming or something like this. So I just think it is like a different environment that we're in where I can be like, let me show you this classic. Like we'll do a Scream marathon and we can talk about this kind of thing and we can talk about the classics. And I'm like, in 20 years, how are they going to talk about classics? How are they going to do that? And are you even going to be able to find them? That's before we get into the ephemera of it, of it existing on the internet and then not existing anymore when so much stuff doesn't exist very long on the internet.
Yep. It's a very similar experience. Again, teaching, like I don't have kids, so teaching is pretty much my interactions with Gen Z aged people. It's not even a matter of what channels do you watch or like what series do you watch. It's they're on YouTube, they're on TikTok. So I mean, what I'm hearing you say, Kelly, is there's an opportunity for some horror on TikTok that we need to really like. I don't know what that looks like. I hope it's not actual real things happening, that people are just video recording. And how do you do that? Like, how do you take a genre like horror and put it on TikTok in these small clips? Like, I'm not sure. That's just thinking out loud.
I'm going to jump in just because there is a person I follow on Instagram that does these little horror shorts. And they're interesting. It's not gory. It's just like this kind of interesting little thing. every story is, 90 seconds? You can't do more than that. So I think there is something on that platform that could be interesting as it comes out. I come back to this claim that you make, Kelly, that monsters are a kind of blank canvas for our burdens and our anxieties. And if there's too many canvases or something, we just don't have a common sense of where we're putting our anxieties. And that itself feels like it just produces anxiety. So it's like this self-perpetuating thing that we're just now in the cycle. And what do we do with it? So I want to kind of imagine that horror is still doing this work. Things like Barbarian and the question about the safety of like an Airbnb or a rental. I recently saw Abigail, which we can talk about that in a longer detail if we want to. But there was something to me about a relationship between parent and child, where parent is putting just something out there for the child to entertain them so that the parent can do whatever they want, tablet kids or something like that.
Yeah.
And so for me as a parent, I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm being seen and judged at the same time, that I've got to put something in front of my children so that I can go do some work too, or something like that. So those are just a few examples that popped up. And I'm curious if you have ideas about like where we place these burdens now on monstrous images, if there's anything like that out there.
I was like racking my brain to think about this morning, where I was like, what do I have, right? In some kind of way. And then I was thinking about, I've been watching Fallout on Amazon. I don't know if either of you have been watching this. It's an apocalyptic tale and it has pseudo zombies, which I didn't know getting into this. Like they pop up everywhere. So I was watching and then my partner was like, oh, look, this kind of has zombies. And I was like, no, right? At this moment where I was like, no, not really. But, I was thinking about apocalyptic fears in a different way, because this is based on a video game, of course, but fears over war and nuclear weapons writ large, with like mutated people, fear of radiation, these kinds of things. And I was just like, this kind of interesting like nostalgia for the 50s and 60s, that's happening there too, about like a time when things were traditional in families, and like this kind of attempt to recreate this in some kind of way, an attempt to like recreate America when there's a chance to, really it's catnip for me, where I was like, if you're going to have a show for me and like hit like all the kind of points of things that I want, like this is really the way my scholar brain kind of works. But the horror of that show, I think, is in the devastation of all of the devastation and all the time it spends on like the desolate landscapes and the violence that it does to people in these landscapes and these kinds of things. And I was just like, it's so interesting to me that after a pandemic, we would have a show where the threat here is nuclear annihilation, not a pandemic taking us out, right? But this other threat that we now could be worried about. And I was trying to think this morning, I was like, what is that about really? Is that a real threat that we're worried about? It's so interesting that would be made right now, that would be something that would appear suddenly and would be popular. I don't know how many people have recommended that show to me, that they're like, oh, this is so good. You have to watch it. You have to watch it. Right. And I'm like, that's intriguing, really, that this would be something on the kind of cultural landscape right now. And that when we have all the things going on that we have going on, other disasters that are real that we could be paying attention to, that this is the one that kind of appears.
Yeah, I think you kind of are already starting to answer the question I was going to ask you, which is talking about like, what are the monstrous images now that are most compelling? And so maybe let's talk a little bit more about like how a landscape can be monstrous, how that can be sort of the monster more so than a guy in a Jason Voorhees mask, or
right,
a monster from outer space, or some sort of creature summoned from hell. So what's it say about our current culture and our values that maybe for like a show like Fallout to be so popular, so successful, that it suddenly is? And I guess The Last of Us is kind of very much this too, where it devastated landscapes. What do we do with that, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting to me that so much of it is like the scenery as a character and is antagonistic towards people. And I will say that I love The Last of Us, and I thought that it was very good, even though it was like emotional roller coaster to watch and remarkably painful. But so much of it is antagonistic landscapes and empty landscapes of people, that so much of that character driven drama is happening when they're in like the snow that can kill you and trying to get to places through like the ruins. And so the horror that can happen to you is what happens to you in these like abandoned places. You know, they had a particularly horrifying scene in a library where I was like, oh, they made the library terrifying so that the library can become a character and can become a horror scene. I loved when you can tell that it was a video game level. Same with Fallout. Like, I love when you can tell that it's actually like a scene that they've translated from the video game. That's one of my favorite parts of these kinds of shows, where I'm like, oh, I can tell that we've entered in a level that we're going to play and do this kind of thing. But yeah, I think that it's fascinating that that can be a horrifying character, more so than some of the other characters on the show, who also are terrible people and do terrible things, right? Because that's kind of consistent with both of those shows. But it makes me wonder why, right? Are these both pseudo-westerns?
I'm your huckleberry.
You know, which I think apocalyptic tales tend to be in some kind of way, which is like my running thesis about this, is that apocalyptic tales tend to be westerns. Like, we like this kind of thing. We like the guns. We like the fighting. We like, you know, this kind of feel to this. But yeah, I wonder about that too, so.
Yeah, just to add to your thesis or your running hypothesis, the road is very much the same way.
Yeah.
I'll also add that kind of in this whole thing, there's two things that came to my mind. One, we already talked about how maybe Gen Z is really worried about climate change. And so what do we have recently? A bunch of hurricanes that have destroyed people's places, lives, etc., right? I think it's worrisome that the environment is becoming a clearer threat. The nuclear aspect of it is also interesting to me because this also comes on the heels of Oppenheimer winning Best Picture. And one of my favorite movies recently was Godzilla -1, which is also a conversation about the nuclear fallout from World War II. And so I don't know what to do with that. But when you're talking about, oh, just post-pandemic, why are we thinking about these landscapes that are dangerous and nuclear worries? I don't know. There's a global aspect to it. There's an environmental aspect to it. There's a part of me that says that makes sense. And that may be the monster that's most compelling. I like that a lot.
No, climate change is a big one, I think, that is really pressing for this generation. I think that they are thinking a lot about it and have a lot of concerns about it. Rightly so. Just wildfires and hurricanes and other storms and clouds of dust, and like, I mean, they have the reasons for it.
We can get to wrapping up here. Are there any recent horror stories that have brought you joy?
I was going to mention one, and that is I read an early version of Sherry Priest's Cinder Witch, which is coming out this summer. It's a novella set in Appalachia. And it is a cozy horror, which is a genre that I love, about a long ago murder and about two women that pair up to solve it, and about all the kind of scary things that start happening to them as they try to figure out what happened and maybe who did this, and the supernatural kind of spookiness that follows them. So I would definitely recommend that. And it was a lot of fun, and it's not super scary, but it's a little scary. So if folks are looking for that kind of thing, it's a nice read. And I would definitely say that it brought me a lot of joy.
I love that. I love that it's in Appalachia. It's cozy. That's amazing. Kelly, I want to say thank you so much for joining us again. You've written a bunch of books. Final Girl, of course, The Zombies Are Coming. This was an incredible book. We loved it. And The Gospel According to the Clan. All three books are great, so check them all out. Also, check out Kelly's podcast, Pod Only Knows. Kelly, thank you again for joining us. This is such a fun conversation and insightful and joyful.
Oh, thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.